Hi, Jess.
Hi, Ned. How are you?
Yeah, well, obviously I'm quite bereft as this is going to be the last episode of this mini-series celebrating 350 years of Chelsea Physic Garden.
I know. It's a sad day, but what better way to bow out than to do an episode all about looking ahead, as this episode is about a physic garden for the future.
It's a pretty big statement and claim, that, isn't it?
Go on.
Well, I mean, I think there's a certain confidence knowing London's constant churn in the assumption that Chelsea Physic Garden will be a physic garden for the future.
Well, it stayed true to its origins, despite the fact that all around it, Chelsea has gone from a rural backwater to a central point of one of the biggest cities in the world.
Yeah, 350 years ago, they didn't quite know about the Industrial Revolution, the tube, even the building of Chelsea Bridge was 170 years off.
Yeah, so I think it's time we kicked things off. And to do that, we need to look at how its future is secured before looking at how the garden itself is safeguarding these precious collections and plants in an increasingly uncertain world.
Let's get into it. Welcome to the Chelsea Physic Garden podcast. Hi, Jess.
Hi, Ned.
Last episode, we went through how the Chelsea Physic came to be there in one of the prime pieces of real estate in the world, I would say. If you think about how many luxury flats would fit on that 3.5 acres of land, how much would the combined rent be? I'd say kind of 10, 20, 30 million.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah, easily.
How much do you think they pay?
I feel like you're going to... Well, I feel like the only way they could survive is with some exception or exemption.
Well, we're calling it Physic Garden for the future.
Yeah.
They kind of have to be able to survive in perpetuity for this podcast not to immediately be dated. And thankfully, they pay in perpetuity a £5 annual rent.
Oh, that makes me feel so happy.
Yep.
That really does.
This dates back to a figure that has come up in every episode we've spoken about, Sir Sloane.
But some good things stay good.
Yes, I would say.
Although, I mean, I feel like we're going to start getting into some controversies here perhaps, but...
We will approach them, I think, towards the end of the episode. Right now, we'll be talking in a very shallow and superficial way about this deal that was made. So... the deed of covenant signed between Sir Sloane.
Much like the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, I never get tired of hearing the deed of covenant. It sounds so Lord of the Rings. I am so here for the Middle Earth of it all.
Oh, yeah. Sir Sloane's deed of covenant with the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries.
I mean, come on, it's giving D&D.
£5 in perpetuity, but there is a catch. It had to remain an establishment for teaching. It also had to send 50 useful plants to the Royal Society in perpetuity for the power and glory of God in the works of the creation, and that their apprentices may the better distinguish good and useful plants from those that bear resemblance to them. Now, this goes back to what we were talking about in the previous episode with poisonous plants being next to plants which look similar but aren't poisonous. It's very specific. But that phrasing, distinguish good and useful plants, and the phrasing of useful plants has meant that a very broad and inclusive interpretation of this original £5 deed of covenant can still be taken today. But we're only skirting around a lot of issues to do with it. You know, there have been a couple of changes, particularly in the last 50 years, namely the transfer of the running of the Chelsea Physic Garden from the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries to the charity which currently runs it. Now, they still have to continue this interpretation of the rules. Now it is open to the public. We're facing an increasingly changing world with the climate crisis, with monocropping, with the destruction of natural habitats continuing at a rate never seen before in human history. So I thought it would be a good idea for us to go to the garden and explore what they're doing to try and protect the natural world, to try and protect our rare and endangered plants.
We've talked so much about connections to the past, but how do we move forward?
So Jess, I'm sending you an assignment. I want you to follow in Napoleon's footsteps and take a trip to St. Helena. In your case, to a...
I don't think we've the budget for that.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just send you to Chelsea Physic Garden instead to look at a plant long for extinct, the St. Helena ebony, which exists, one of a few places that exists in the world, is the Chelsea Physic Garden.
Mission accepted. So now we're beside a plant that I had never heard of before, the Chelsea Physic Garden. This is the St. Helena ebony. I'm assuming that name has a lot to do with where this plant is from. So let's kick it off with, where is St. Helena exactly?
Yes, so you are right. The plant is endemic to the island of St. Helena, which is in the Atlantic Ocean, in the middle of the road between Madeira and the Cape, in the middle of the ocean. Yeah.
So it's in the middle of nowhere. When did humans first encounter St. Helena?
So we believe that the island was first encountered by the Portuguese in 1502. We can't really be sure of this because there are other sort of accounts of like other travelers that might have encountered the island, but that's the earliest record we have of the island being encountered by humans.
What was the interaction? Because often with these places that have a delicate, unique ecosystem, humans come along and disrupt that.
Yes, so that's exactly what happened.
I really could feel like that's where this was going. So yeah, can you tell us a bit about what happened there and how perhaps it led to this plant being here?
Yes, so this plant today is considered as being critically endangered. It's on the IUCN Red List as critically endangered. So what we think happened to it is that when the Portuguese first encountered the island, it was during the time when Portuguese would travel and sail across the world, and this island happened to be in the middle of their maritime routes. And so when they encountered it, they decided to not permanently settle in it, but to introduce a bunch of new species on the island so that if there was a shipwreck, they could go there and find food that they were familiar with, or that they could stop there if they needed. So they introduced some citrus species and a few plants, and then they also introduced goats.
On paper, it sounds great. On paper, it makes a lot of sense. However, pretty catastrophic, I imagine, for a lot of these indigenous species.
Yes, so it's often the case with species on islands because it's a very specific ecosystem. And so what we think happened with this plant is that when the goats were introduced, they started multiplying as they would do because...
Those goats, those Andy goats.
and they became a problem really fast because I think there's records from maybe the 17th century of hunting parties being organized to actually kill the goats that had been introduced by the humans beforehand. And they didn't quite manage to manage the population.
So it's like a very human solution for a very human-caused issue.
Yeah.
Let's bring goats. Let's kill the goats. Oh, we can't manage the population. Yeah.
Yes. We've heard this
Explorers
story
be
many
exploring,
times.
conquerors be conquering.
So the goats became a problem. They ate a lot of the vegetation there. And by the end of the 19th century, the plant St. Helena ebony was last seen by the British naturalist Charles Mellis. And then for about 100 years, everyone thought it was extinct because it couldn't be seen on the island of St. Helena. The genus and this family had been there for thousands of years. There was this period of 100 years where people thought it was extinct. And then there's a student who was on the island for, I think, a research trip who came across it. He was with George Benjamin, who was his guide on the island, and they saw this plant growing sort of on the edge of a cliff. And they were really curious about it because it looked unfamiliar, but because it would require someone with really good sort of climbing skills, they asked George's brother, Charlie, to climb. And so Charlie went up or down. I don't remember how they got there, but they got there. And they took some clippings of the plants. Right. So they took a few cuttings, they took seeds, and they took flowers. So after this, on the island of St. Helena, they started doing what is called in situ conservation. And so they tried to sort of take those cuttings to generate more plants, to have more of these plants. So all of the cuttings or all of the plants that now exist are descendants of this plant that was found on the cliff.
Wow.
And so the plant that we have here at the garden is also a descendant of this plant.
And what does the Chelsea Physic Garden do to protect plants that are on this red list, plants like the St. Helena ebony? How do you care for it, protect it, particularly when the garden's open to the public as well?
Yeah, so in the case of the St. Helena ebony, so what we're doing here is called ex situ conservation. So ex situ.
Say that again.
Ex situ conservation.
Okay, ex situ conservation. Yes, gotcha.
As opposed to in situ.
And yes, understood. Catching up with my Latin when I'm here, you know. It's always a Latin lesson at the Chelsea Physic Garden.
And so the goal of ex situ conservation is to be able to preserve plants that maybe have a hostile native environment. Maybe they're not able to live in their native environment anymore. Or it's to sort of create this, it's like seed banks. Is to have a specimen somewhere else in case something happens. We have it here. And also to allow people to come across it and become more aware of what's happening. Because the goal is not only to preserve it here and not care about the actual native environment.
Very important.
Yeah, so we have a few plants at the garden that are endangered in the wild, and then we're preserving them here. And it's quite interesting because there's a few of them. So we have Malva phoenicea, which comes from the Canary Islands. And it's very interesting because this plant in the wild struggles to survive because its pollinator disappeared, because it's pollinated by a very specific species of bird that's present on the island.
Such a knock-on effect of extinction.
Yes, and then there's this other plant, which is Puya chilensis, which comes from Chile. And similarly, this plant supports the life cycle of a very important butterfly, which is called Castria eudesmia, or shagwell butterfly. And so what I'm trying to say is just that it's very important that we do ex situ conservation here, but we also have to bear in mind the actual native environment of the plant and the ecosystem is part of, because a lot of the plants we have here, we sort of move the plant, but then the butterfly didn't come with it, the pollinator didn't come with it. So it's also a way for people to interact with the plant and to become more interested in the plant, and for them to take this home and be like, okay, what am I going to do about the environment, and how am I going to preserve the environment to make sure that those ecosystems are able to live on, and not just the plant independently in this garden as like the one survivor of the species.
Amazing.
Something I've always wondered, Ned, is how do they keep track of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, in the last few episodes, we've seen papyrus, we've seen St. Helena ebony, which is going extinct. We've seen ferns, we've seen such a range of things. And I suddenly taken for granted that keeping track of this huge collection might not be the easiest thing in the world.
No, because it's not like your average museum. It's a living, breathing, as you were saying, garden, and an urn won't die or give disease to the other urns. There's so many moving parts and variables.
Thankfully, I have found just the person to answer our questions, because Lily Barris-Hagen, now, she's not just a horticulturalist at Chelsea Physic Garden, she's also the plants records manager. Feels like our prayers have been answered.
Well, this is the person who's keeping it all straight.
So I'm off back to Chelsea Physic Garden to talk to her. So I am in the office of Lily Barris-Hagen, who is a gardener and the plants record manager. I didn't really know much about the plants records. To be honest, I've not thought that much about it, but I thought it was something that was really compelling that we really actually need to shine a light on, because for essentially what is a living museum to exist and to be able to kind of successfully carry on, good records is important, but it's a bit different with plants, isn't it, Lily?
Yeah, so I think the main difference would be that in a museum or a library as well, this could almost be seen as like managing a library, a collection of things that have numbers that are accessioned. Typically, you wouldn't have offspring. You'd have the one item, you'd have an exhibition piece, for example, an artifact, and you would be tracking where it came from, where it's moved, literally the location within that museum, where it's moved to. And if you were to donate it or to put it on exhibition somewhere else, you would also track that information. But the difference we have with plants is that we can propagate them. We can create new lines. We call them line numbers, and they fall under the kind of the number that we've given them, the overarching number. And it's really important for us to know where they came from. And by using the records management that's used in a lot of botanical gardens, we are able to actually track exactly the offspring from each plant and track it all the way back. And that's really helpful for us when we look into things like diseases. So we need to have someone coming in and looking at it. And by us having these records and images and all the dates that things have happened to that plant, the procedures that have taken place, it actually supports us in making sure that what we're displaying is the correct thing and that we know how to take care of it.
And we're looking at the list right now of one of these plants, and it stretches down to...
I mean, this one goes all the way into the 70s.
Into 70 different offspring of one plant, all with the same accession number. With these details, we can see when they died, their cause of death, a lot of death natural cause, which sounds kind of quite human.
So the natural cause versus horticultural cause. Horticultural cause of death just means that we decided to discard that plant for whatever reason.
Yeah,
natural
it's a bit
cause,
of a euphemism then.
Yeah,
we killed it.
Yeah,
and
it's tricky because a lot of the time it's not that we killed it. We just decided, we took the decision to no longer have it in the collection. Natural cause, all that means is that plant is an annual or biennial and basically had come to the end of its life naturally.
Okay.
Horticultural is, we thought that's looking quite ropey, or we've decided we're going to replace it with something else and we removed it.
But also what I love in this is you include the pictures, the paintings and photos of the plants as the offspring, which I think there's something quite artistic about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this role is to support the Florilegium Society, which is an incredible group of fantastically talented artists who paint photorealistic paintings of the plants in the garden. And that falls under records as well. So I will collect cuttings. They'll make a request and I'll collect the cutting from the plant. You try and get the best representation of that plant. And many, many paintings are created throughout the year. And then some of us, including me, will assess those paintings for whether they look like the true representation of that plant. And if so, they can join our collection as part of the Florilegium. Aside from the Florilegium, we also have the herbarium. And between the herbarium, which is basically cuttings of plants that have been preserved, along with the herbarium, the Florilegium paintings and the photos we have of the plants, it really supports our taxonomist to make a confident determination.
I just think it sums up quite a lot of what I like about visiting the Chelsea Physic Garden, which is this overlapping thing of these are all plants for humans, but also that doesn't just mean they're plants for human consumption, they're also plants for humans' enjoyment. So do you know how many plants there are in the garden?
Yeah, so we have in the garden right now, living existing plants, we have 6,063 plants. And then obviously, as we've discussed, we have accessions. So those plants fit under 4,621 accessions. And it kind of gets honed further and further down. Something that I find really helpful and is sometimes quite difficult to explain is the idea of taxa. So taxa is really important when you're talking about plant records because taxa is basically it's almost like the title of the plant. So, and it's like, we don't want to say species because it can include cultivars and things that aren't actually technically species. But essentially, if a plant comes into the collection and there's no record of it ever having been that type of plant has never been in our collection before, that's a new taxa. So we've had, because of the glasshouse project that's going on, the restoration, we've had loads of new taxa, which is really exciting. And yeah, at the moment now, as it stands, we have a total of 3,803 existing taxa of plants. We have way more when we include seed.
Is everything on display? Because I know British Museum, 3% of what they have is on display.
Yeah, so with us, almost everything, most plants are on display because we don't have a lot. We're 4 acres. We haven't got loads of space. But because of that, I actually found a really interesting stat the other day, which was about the kind of density. We're 4 acres, so we're quite small when you look at other botanical gardens that have masses and masses of space. So I looked at how many taxa, so that's not individual plants, but kind of occurrences of different types of plants, if that makes sense. It's really hard. The word taxa doesn't really have a synonym. I can't really explain it more than that. But when you walk through the garden, what I've worked out is every 5 steps you take in this garden, you're encountering a completely unique taxa.
Oh, wow.
That's the density of diversity in our plants in the garden. And when you go into the glass houses, it's like 2 per square metre. It's 10 times as diverse within our glass houses. So it just shows you, like, we have a small space, but we pack it with a lot of diverse plants. And we're kind of constantly building on that by bringing in new taxa.
And finally, to end on the ancient, what's the oldest plant in the garden that you're aware of?
Oh, it's really, really hard to say. I can't tell you what the oldest plant is to date because we've had to transfer we have written records that we've had to transfer onto our database.
And so you're still doing that? Is that still in progress?
It's been done now. It's been finished. But knowing when a plant actually was in the garden or when it was accessioned are 2 different things.
Oh, interesting.
But what we can use, and what I actually have done quite recently, is talk to people. So there are people who've been guides in this garden, doing the guided tours around the garden every day for 30 plus years. They have amazing knowledge of the plants that are still there, particularly about trees. Trees are quite hard for accessioning because a tree that's 20 metres tall, depending on how fast it's growing, it's really hard to, without kind of
cutting it open.
I think it's dendronology. Anyway, without that knowledge, it's really hard to actually age it. But you can talk to someone who can say, oh, that looked like that 30 years ago. And then I put that in our records because that tells me that even though it was only accessioned, there's a ginkgo, for example, it was only accessioned in the 90s, but she's seen it from the 80s. She's been looking and talking about that plant since the 80s. So we just constantly add in to things. I mean, something else I want to look into is paintings. This garden predates photography, obviously. And we have some really great paintings that we might even be able to do ID of the plants in those paintings to find out if any of those plants still exist in the garden now. And that will tell us, again, it won't tell us how old that plant is, but it will tell us the earliest record of it in the garden.
Yeah, so you're going to have to go back to Elizabeth Blackwell's. But
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
These are the challenges.
Yeah.
These are the challenges with working with a database, but with living kind of material, living collections. But it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's there's always
It really
something.
is.
There's always some kind of nugget of information you find. And yeah, it's you're basically recording the story of that plant.
Jess, we've been going to the garden quite a lot and we've been talking about the collections, we've been talking about the plants, but there's one thing front and centre in the garden. There is one site, should we say, one display that is not living, is not breathing. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm assuming the statue.
Yep, the statue.
Big old statue.
Exactly. Big old statue looms large in the garden of Sir Hans Sloane.
Mm-hmm.
We spoke about him in reference to the cotton, and Eve spoke about his slightly controversial history around that.
We debunked some myths, I think.
But he is a very controversial man.
History is not black and white.
No.
As we know. History, as is often claimed, is written by the victors. So we often get a slant on a story that is one side. You know, I had an old English lecturer who once said, whose favourite quote was that every document is an act of barbarism because it suppresses another viewpoint. But what do you have to say about the person to whom we owe so much, but to whom, I'll be honest, there's gaps in my knowledge? And I know there's some swirling controversies, as there always is when you take things from places.
Since 2020, since BLM movement, organisations have had to reckon with their often inglorious and controversial past. As this can be quite a controversial thing at times. I don't really understand why there's controversy around it, but I thought it would be really important to go and talk directly to the Chelsea Physic Garden about how they deal with this controversial figure and his central role in the history of the garden.
Well, I'm fascinated to learn more because I think so many institutions now are negotiating a new world where the full history is to be taken into account, and we have to have this 3 sort of dimensional thinking around these things, and not just like taking the 2D print off the page, but we need dialogue, we need discussion, we need to be informed. So let's go straight to the source.
So here I am with Francis Sampere. Over the last 3 episodes, we've spoken a lot about this character, Hans Sloane, this guy who's got this kind of integral place in the history of the Chelsea Physic Garden and Chelsea itself. This guy is clearly unbelievably wealthy to have such a long legacy, but how did he make his fortune?
Great question. So Hans Sloane completed his kind of apothecary training, so to speak. He did some studying at the garden when he was a younger man, and he was a great intellectual, and he got picked up by the Duke of Albemarle to be a physician in Jamaica. And it was while he was in Jamaica that he did a lot of his studying. He learned a lot about botany, and most importantly, he learnt about chocolate while he was out there. So this knowledge came from indigenous people. There were women primarily that he witnessed preparing a drink using chocolate, and they would mix it with a little bit of sugar, some milk, and that made the bitter taste of the chocolate more palatable to infants, and it was said to kind of make them feel better when they were ill. So Sloane collected a lot of knowledge and then brought that back to England. That's really where his finances start to grow, and he accumulates this wealth.
You said that he was a physician for the Duke of Albemarle. Was that primarily working for enslaved people?
So he would have worked for the Duke of Albemarle and the Duke of Albemarle's family. I'm not entirely sure about his relationship to the enslaved people that would have been on the plantations locally. It can be assumed that he would have worked as a physician with these individuals, but it's important to question the motivation behind some of those interactions. So whereas the motivation for working with Europeans would have been to make them better, the work that would have been carried out with enslaved people might have also been a more scientific exploration. And it's really important for us to just think about the time in which this was taking place in the 1700s and the different mindset that people had at this time. So we have records from Sloane that he didn't always treat enslaved people in a way that we would describe as moral or kind of kindly. From his own diaries, we can read that. And the work that he would have gained a great deal of knowledge from working with these individuals. But unfortunately, I can't kind of specify what he would have done. But I think that understanding of the motivation, that desire to heal, and then also the desire to learn is important to consider.
So that's one way in which Jamaica and the transatlantic slave trade played into his wealth. But there was another link through his wife, Elizabeth Langley Rose, wasn't there?
Yeah, so Elizabeth Langley Rose was the inheritor of several plantations in Jamaica where enslaved people worked, or enslaved people were put to work, rather. And this obviously generated a great deal of wealth, and that wealth was for the family.
And so as a man in the 17th century, essentially in the marriage, her wealth becomes his. Is that a kind of correct understanding of how it would have worked?
Yeah, so marriage was very different to how we might consider marriage today. There was a degree of ownership. So that idea of the bride being given away at the wedding day, it's being passed from the caretaking of her father to the caretaking of her now husband. So that's why we would say that Elizabeth Langley's property and these plantations and the enslaved peoples that worked on them were her property, and they would have been subsequently the property of her husband.
And so this presents a very complicated story to tell for the Chelsea Physic Garden, because there's no denying Sir Hans Sloane's generosity in the sustaining of the Chelsea Physic Garden and why it's in its current form and why its future is almost kind of settled. How does Chelsea Physic Garden deal with this very complicated legacy?
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well just then. It is a very complicated legacy. So as a scientific organisation, we do rely on facts. So we can say Sir Hans Sloane was a benefactor of the garden. He was an incredibly important figure in securing the legacy of the garden, or in sustaining the garden, as you phrased it. But he also benefited from the work of enslaved people, from the knowledge of enslaved people, and he didn't always treat those individuals kindly in a way that we would like to think we would treat people today. So we hold up those facts and try not to cast a judgment or opinion on him, but open up a story and a conversation for people to understand him better. And it might prompt people that visit the garden to want to go and learn a little bit more, to read into this subject a bit more. But we try and hold these two truths so that people can learn about them and kind of inform themselves about them more broadly.
Have there been any calls to take the statue down in the middle of the garden?
So we want to be a garden for all at Chelsea Physic Garden, and there's lots of different ways that we become a garden for all, whether it's physical accessibility, intellectual accessibility. There's lots of different things that we need to do and consider. When it comes to the statue in the centre of the garden, that's an area that's really debated at the moment. It's a tool for the culture wars that are currently part of our cultural landscape. I think what's really important for us is that the statue isn't the only way in which we can make the garden a welcoming experience for all. There are other plants where we can use, rather than a European common name for a plant, for example, we might want to use the Afrikaans name for a South African plant rather than using the English name, things like that. It's really important for us to think more broadly and holistically how we can improve, not just through looking at the statue. We've got interpretation by the statue now, and we do invite members of the public, of course, to write their opinions into us. And I respond to those emails about the statue and have really fantastic conversations about the impact the statue has on individuals, how it made them feel, what we're doing, and how we can learn best and move on from that. So it's a real personal connection that people have. And I think that there's no kind of straight answer right now for what we're doing, other than looking at the garden holistically, responding to individual feedback and planning for the future. But we would definitely like to de-center the statue from the experience.
So, Jess, I did realise that I had been speaking about the past a little bit too much in this episode about a physic garden for a future, but don't worry, because I did ask Frances what her vision for the next big projects involving the garden would be. Here's her answer.
Well, I think for the garden, we are always embracing the latest horticultural technology. And of course, we've been a place of horticultural innovation over the centuries. But today, we live in a technological age. My big question is, how can we perhaps connect the garden more with that technological age? And that really seems to me one of the areas that we can develop in the future. For example, do we create immersive worlds where you could walk around the garden from your living room without having to come here? Do we create kind of sci-fi inspired, 3D projections of plants that you can have in a hospital room that you can't have in there because you can't bring in plant material into there? How can we make it a bit more cheery? So there's lots of ways that we could perhaps embrace technology. And we've been doing some work with the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital to think about that. And we've done experiments the garden's been used in experiments of creating an immersive experience for people to lower their stress levels before going into surgery. So there's lots of opportunities that we can think about today. And I think that's the next big hurdle for us.
So I'm going to end on a little bit of irony.
How very English of you.
Yeah.
Because you're very good at that.
Well, I mean, this is more, not dramatic irony, but I would say nature's irony. This statue of interest seems very old. It seems like a permanent fixture of the garden. Ironically, it's one of the things in the garden which has had the biggest issues. The statue you see before you is not the original 1732 one made by the great sculptor Michael Rysbrack, a Belgian who was brought over, who made a very famous statue of Isaac Newton in Trinity College. The original statue had to be moved in 1983 after huge issues with the alkalinity of the environment, of continual freezing.
Way. Stop it.
Yep, this perpetual statue that, as I say, there are no calls to take down.
But it was getting battered by the elements.
It was getting battered by the elements. And in fact, the statue we see before us is a plaster cast. In the mid-1990s, a swarm of bees found some holes which had been made in the fiberglass cast that had been put in display in place of the original statue. So the British Museum had to agree to provide a second replica. It's an artificial mix of resin and stone known as jesmonite. It looks a bit aged and worn. That's not ancient. That's in the last 30 years.
Oh my goodness. So first the elements, then the bees.
And now just the fact that it's made of inferior in inverted commas. It's made of a material which does get affected by acid rain, by pollution and stuff.
Nature's not letting anyone off the hook.
Certainly isn't. So on that note, I think it's time to look to the future and look for the next 350 years of how the garden will protect itself in a environment which can be literally poisonous,
inhospitable, punishing.
And on that note, we'll say goodbye until next time.
Until next time. Thank you for listening to the Chelsea Physic Garden podcast. A special thanks to Eve Barrow, Lily Barris-Hargan, Francis Sampaio and everyone at Chelsea Physic Garden. Thank you too to Pierre O'Reilly for our wonderful music.